Let's wait for a couple more participants to join before we get started. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today and joining part 2 of Trauma and Resilience in Tribal Communities with Amy Foster Wolferman and Veronica Willetto Ducrane. If you didn't catch part 1, you can watch a recorded version or any other session at the end of today. All sessions for all 3 days will be recorded and uploaded to this website under the agenda tab for your viewing pleasure and will be available for a month after the PD meeting is over. So next slide, just a quick disclaimer, and then I'll kick it over to Amy and Veronica. This presentation was produced under the U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises Incorporated. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. All right. Amy and Veronica.
Thank you, Capella. All right. Welcome back to those of you who are rejoining us after part 1, and welcome to those of you who are just now joining us for the first time for the second part. My name is Amy Foster Wolferman with the National Native Children's Trauma Center, and I serve as the Director of School-Based Training and Technical Assistance. My background is in teaching and special education and working with youth in the outdoors. My colleague Veronica will reintroduce herself in a few moments. And I just want to recap for those of you who were not here before that we were talking about trauma, different types of trauma, including historical trauma to sort of develop that context, and then looking at the impact of trauma on different developmental areas. And that's where we stopped, and we have a bit more to continue in that area before we start to look at building resilience and protective factors. All right. So putting ourselves back into the minds of those children of ours, those youth who may have some trauma histories, impacts of trauma, this particular study could help us relate to that mode of being in a highly stressed mode where we're always constantly looking out for danger. And so I wanted to share this with you, and it's a study that was done by Dr. Seth Pollack from the University of Wisconsin. And he took images of faces and morphed different levels of different types of emotions into these faces. And if you start by looking at the far right of the screen, just in the chat, if you could share what emotion, and we're just going with the basics, you don't have to really overanalyze this. What basic emotion would you say that is on the far right? Any ideas? And you can just throw that out in the chat. What emotion would you say those faces are on the far right? Concern, empathy, distress, concern. And think of kind of in the preschool terminology of your 4 basic emotions. Those are great. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you for looking at these and really considering what the emotion might be. What they were going for was sadness. And then on the far left, what would you say the emotion is reflected, highlighted over there? The far left, right? Mad, anger. Absolutely. Okay, thank you for rage, anger. Excellent. You got it. So what Dr. Pollack did was asked a group of youth who had experienced abuse and a group that had not experienced abuse individually. So they weren't doing this as a group, they did it one at a time, but asked them to look at these faces, starting from the far right, the emotion of sadness, and then moving towards the left, towards anger. So starting on the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where, starting from the right at number 1, where do you first detect anger in the face as you move towards the left? What number? Where do you see it? Again, you can share that in the chat if you wouldn't mind. We have some 1s, 8s, 9s, 6, 7, 8, 7, 5, 8, 7. Okay, a lot of mid-range numbers here. This is great. Oh yeah, and just to announce, when you're posting in the chat, a lot of us are posting to just the hosts and panelists and not to everyone. So I don't see an everyone option. I see hosts, producer, Capella, and Veronica. Thank you for sharing in the chat. Hopefully you're able to reach the everyone tab. So what Dr. Pollock identified in his research, okay, great, Jamie, was that those who had experienced, who had not experienced abuse, first detected anger somewhere around 7s, 8s, and 9s, while those who had experienced abuse were detecting anger around 3s and 4s. And so that's a pretty big jump, a pretty big difference between those two groups. What do you think might be the reason that those who had experienced abuse were seeing anger when maybe others weren't detecting it? Or potentially when it wasn't even there? Why are they applying anger because these are the folks who have been experienced abuse? Why would they see it and those who hadn't experienced abuse? Okay, maybe they see it in the eyes. Yeah, hypervigilance, right? They are looking out for danger. The kids that aren't seeing it maybe aren't as experienced at differentiating those kinds of emotions. Those kids could be hypersensitive to any kind of change in the adult, right? They need to be ready. They need to be looking out for danger. They need to notice it when it's changing so that they can protect themselves, right? Yeah, be on the defense. They've had that experience. They've seen that face turn to anger more quickly. Right. Absolutely. So what these kids were doing was exactly what you would expect them to do, and that is get really good at identifying emotions and faces and being able to use that good detective work to protect themselves. And that's great when you are applying that to in a situation where you are in danger or potentially in danger. But when you start to see a face that you think is anger, but it's actually not, then you're sort of over applying your false sense of threat and danger to a situation that isn't. And so we might react or respond in this neutral situation in a way that isn't warranted or needed. So it's over applying our defensive mechanisms in places where we don't need to. Absolutely. So thanks for all of your input there. Yeah, we know that our kids are really working hard to protect themselves, and they're using the skill of detecting emotion to be ready to do so. So to continue on with the impacts of trauma, one of the most prominent characteristics of our kids that have trauma histories is having some difficulty with self-regulation. And it's when we've talked a lot about how there might be experiencing trauma reminders or triggers. They might be hyper aroused, so they're constantly looking out for danger. They have this fear kind of instilled in them. They're more stressed, more worried, more anxious. And these are a lot of the different emotions that they're experiencing. And so it can be really difficult to understand, one, what I'm feeling, how it shows up in my body, how my thoughts might be associated with what I'm feeling, how what's happening in the environment might be associated. And when we don't know what we're feeling, and it's difficult to a lot of times for these kids to discriminate between the different types of emotions. So maybe that they talk about having a trial size box of crayons. So knowing sad, mad, glad as the basic emotions, but really struggling to understand the difference between nervous and frustrated and embarrassed, and excited, and that a lot of things just get lumped into I'm just mad or I'm just sad, right? Um, and so a lot of our kids then, when not knowing what's happening internally, and then oftentimes just all of a sudden feeling these intense emotions, it can be difficult to regulate them, for to bring down the level of intensity if we want or need to, and then very difficult to then communicate what those emotions are, what they're coming from, and what our underlying needs are. And, fortunately, these are all things that we can help support our youth in developing, working really explicitly on teaching emotion identification, where emotions show up in our bodies, how we communicate them. And so again, I just want to point out that the feelings that are often we're often walking around with when we have these histories of trauma is this increased worry and fear, shame and guilt oftentimes, and then the experience of joy can be rare. So that's another thing to consider and think about in terms of when we're supporting our youth, is how often are we intentionally instilling opportunities for joy, not just for our youth, but for ourselves. And then if we look at the impact on social development, we know that trauma typically occurs within the context of relationship. And so it can be really difficult for those with trauma histories and backgrounds to trust, right? Bad things have happened to me by people. Maybe bad things have happened to me by adults. I don't trust adults. So we might see too, with these intense emotions, we can see difficulties with getting along sometimes in relationships. So there might be social cues that are missed because we're not accurately reading some of the emotions. We might be over projecting that we're being rejected by our peers when we're not. And so additional conflicts might arise. And so if we have this mindset that we're continuing to expect bad treatment, we might see it when it's really not happening, again, leading to conflict. And so we also see that kids might feel a little estranged or isolated from others, thinking maybe that what I've experienced is something unique to me. I'm alone in this. And so we might see additional movement towards isolation and withdrawal. So another thing we might see too is that a lot of our kids with trauma histories have had unhealthy boundaries modeled for them. And so we might see kids sort of over cross boundaries. Maybe a child might feel like it's okay to come hug or sit on the lap of someone that they really actually don't know. Or we might see kids in the very opposite direction, not be able to share any kind of affection or expression of connection or kindness or love. And trauma also, of course, impacts our mind, our brain. We know that when we are in a state of hyperarousal and we are looking out for danger, or when we're having those, we're re-experiencing those uncontrollable thoughts that are entering our mind, or we're numbing, any of those common reactions to trauma, our brain is, not lock solid. It's escalating and moving. It's starting to flip. So our prefrontal cortex is not fully engaged and able to operate in an optimal manner. So we have difficulty with all of these skills of being present, being able to engage, to hear and process what is being said to us, to remember things that have been said to us. So we see that we are not utilizing our prefrontal cortex or the cognitive skills of our brain as often as we are using our limbic system, our emotional reactive system, because that's what we need to protect ourselves, and we're always on guard. So we want to be creating these opportunities for our youth to feel safe and comfortable enough to let their guards down so that their brains can fully engage and be able to learn and to process and be present. So we definitely see oftentimes kids get behind academically, have difficulty with that academic performance and achievement. And sometimes they get mislabeled as having a learning disorder when actually it's this impact of trauma. And we just need to meet them where they're at and we can catch them up. We also see diagnoses inaccurate, sometimes like ADHD or bipolar, again, when it's really just traumatic stress symptoms. And with all of this, when kids are getting behind, they can start to have this self-fulfilling prophecy of, I can't do this, I'm stupid, I'm dumb, there's something wrong with me, and start to get frustrated with themselves and give up and not try. And that's where we see higher rates of dropout. So I wanted to share a little bit from Dr. Bruce Perry, who is the director of the Child Trauma Academy. He wrote the book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And he was a clinical psychiatrist. And the book includes a number of different stories of clients he had going back to young adults or adults going back to early childhood and telling their stories of trauma and how that later impacted them. So it's very interesting book. He also wrote a book recently with Oprah Winfrey called What Happened to You. So I highly recommend both of those. But he created the neurosequential development model, kind of looking at trauma and how it overlays on the brain. And so just pulling from some of his work, if you look at this chart, we have 3 rows. The bottom row is labeled internal state. So tell me in the chat, if you would, of these different mental states or internal states of calm, alert, alarm, fear, and terror, where do you do your best thinking? Which internal state are you in when your brain is at its best? Okay, thanks for sharing the books, Veronica. Oh, great. Calm, calm, calm to alert. Yeah. Defiance, calm. Where your brain is at its most optimal space for learning. It's fully engaged. It's not escalated. Great. Calm, alert in a safe way. Right. Okay, great. Yeah, and that's exactly what Dr. Perry has found in his work, that when our brains are in this state of calm or alert, we can fully engage and utilize them, and we can do our best thinking. So now think about a youth who may be experiencing some trauma in their lives, maybe living in a more chaotic environment. What mental state would you guess they wake up in the morning and nothing has even happened yet? Just again, along that bottom row, calm, alert, alarm, fear, terror. What mental state or internal state might a youth who's experiencing trauma in their lives wake up in? Fear or alarm? Yep. Fear or alarm, fear. Yep. Alert, alarm, or fear. Yep. Great. Fear. Yep. And so Dr. Perry has found that, a lot of our kids with trauma histories, their resting heart rate tends to be higher than the norm, as well as their blood pressure. They're on that high alert. And so when they wake up in the morning and nothing's even happened, they tend to wake up in a state of alarm already. And so if you go up to the top row labeled hyperarousal continuum, these are the kids that tend to be more of the fight, flight, freeze. It's the fighters. So when they wake up in the morning in a state of alarm, they wake up resistant, right? Resistant. So let's say you are a teacher and you have a student coming into your room and they're already walking in that door resistant. And it may not take very much, if we think back to some of those trauma reminders or triggers, of alarm to a state of fear. And so that For the hyperarousal continuum, that looks like moving from resistant to defiant. And so with the child that I worked with, proximity, being too close in his space was a trigger. And so I'd go near him and say, hey, show me what you're working on. And he would move from a state of resistance to defiance and shove that paper and kick the floor and, stomp his feet and get up. And if I moved in a little bit closer to say, hey, that's not okay, I need you to show me what you're working on, he would completely lose it and go into a state of terror and get aggressive, right? And pound the wall and walk out of the classroom. And so this child, we know, is struggling because their response is external. We can see they're having some difficulties. But this other child who might be on the dissociative continuum, that middle row, when they wake up in a state of alarm, like of the fight, flight, freeze, this is more like the freezer. So when they wake up in a state of alarm, they wake up compliant. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want anyone's eyes on them. They just want to go under the radar, which they do. They're very good at that. So if this child, as the student, comes into my classroom, very compliant, when I come and say, hey, show me what you're working on, and being too close in this child's space is also triggering. It doesn't feel comfortable. This child, instead of getting defiant, will dissociate and check out. So rather than yell or shove the paper, this child might say nothing, right? Just completely shut down and say nothing. And I might get a little bit closer in their space, and then they might really check out. I've never yet seen a child faint, but definitely seen that checking out and kind of numbing and not being responsive. So this child, we might have a difficult time really trying to understand. We might misinterpret their behavior and think that maybe they don't know the answer, maybe they're not paying attention, maybe they're being passive aggressive, all these things that we might think, when actually this child is in a state of fear. Okay, I see a question in the Q&A, and I'll get to that in a wee bit. Thank you, Stacy. All right, any questions or comments about these different internal states and sort of the hyperarousal continuum and the dissociative continuum? So the question in the Q&A is, do you suggest using ACEs with students to measure trauma? And I'm glad you brought up that question. I think that if we were to do something like that, we would definitely need a lot of support in place to be responsive. I don't find that. Oh, I think that this question has been answered live. Sorry, I'm not used to that. We should be able to see that here shortly.
Amy, it looks like that was just when somebody opened the Q&A chat box, it looks like it was just resolved, but you can continue to answer the question if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I would suggest that it not be done. I've definitely seen schools say, we're going to watch Paper Tigers. We're going to have all of our students take the ACE score questionnaire. And it can be re-traumatizing for a lot of our kids. And then the school is left, if they're not prepared, kind of opening up a situation that they're not prepared to handle. And I don't know that having knowing a child's trauma is going to be helpful, as opposed to knowing the impacts. And so we often, some of the interventions that we offer, we have a mental health professional who might go in and conduct specific assessments, one looking at life events, looking at trauma, experiences of trauma, and also looking at traumatic stress symptoms. And those two questionnaires together sort of inform whether this child might be eligible for a particular intervention. but that is not done with all students. That's done with students of concern, and it's done by a mental health professional, and it's knowing that there's an intervention in place to provide supports. Veronica, did you have, let's see, you came on, and I wasn't sure if you're just joining to show us your face or you had something you wanted to share. You're good. Okay. Yep. And yeah, if others want to respond as well, please do. Thank you for the question. I just think there's a lot of caution around utilizing the AIDS questionnaire with our youth. Definitely that need some mental health supports in place. Okay. Oh, I know why you came on, Veronica. It's your turn. Thanks, everyone.
All right, great question. I think that's really important to ask ourselves if some of these screeners are helpful, and at what times and in what context they can be helpful. So I just wanted to walk us through a bit of a summary of what we've been covering so far. For those of you who are just joining us, we started out in the first part talking about the different type, what trauma is, and then the different types of trauma. And so we really took a deep dive into historical trauma in order to really provide context, because in tribal communities, we are aware of the fact that historical trauma is often the soil in which other traumas in the lives of individuals and in the lives of families are taking root. So we can see that on the screen here with this image. And I know that the triangle is a really popular way to kind of describe certain phenomena. And so we're kind of talking today about the impact of trauma. And so we want to begin by first acknowledging the impact of historical trauma and how that sets up or creates adverse community environments or social conditions. It contributes to what's happening in local contexts. That really is the influencing children experiencing adversity. So before we even begin talking about child trauma and child traumatic stress, we're just kind of acknowledging the context that this happens within the context of historical trauma, and it happens within the context of community and just different social conditions that are occurring within a child's life, as well as with that are impacting a family, the family that that child is a part of. And so then we find ourselves as educators with children that are experiencing adversity. And as Amy said, they were exposed to trauma. But more than that, maybe we're finding that that exposure has led to traumatic symptoms, traumatic stress symptoms. And so we're seeing, as Amy explained in the previous session, you know, sometimes those trauma responses decrease over time, and because of positive childhood experiences that are happening as well in a child's life, that that actually buffers them against the impacts of trauma. And so that can actually, though that adversity and the effects of those of adversity can actually wane over time. But when we are seeing that, especially when it comes to complex trauma, which is often what we are finding in tribal communities and with our tribal youth, what they experience the most is complex trauma versus just acute trauma experiences. And so we're finding that that often leads to an impact on development. And so Amy kind of walked us through the different ways that it affects child development. So much so that we can find children impacted by trauma are missing some important developmental tasks, and they haven't completed some of those important developmental tasks in all of those developmental domains. And so they are needing some extra supports, and we kind of see that happening just cognitively and socially, in the different ways that it's showing up in the lives of our students. And then because of those developmental impacts, we kind of find that we're seeing in children impacted by trauma that they're experiencing some impairments, different types of impairments. And then it's leading in some cases to maladaptive ways of coping. As we saw in the video in the first session, they're trying to learn to cope. And so they have these survival mechanisms that they're utilizing in order to really cope with some of the trauma responses that they're experiencing. And so some of those maladaptive ways of coping are some of the issues that we're seeing with our students. Maybe some of the drug use, some of the suicidality, trying to find a way to deal with what it is that they're faced with, the overwhelming experience that they're going through. And so that is then leading to, as we saw in the ACE study, that leads to some poor health outcomes for our tribal youth that we're trying to intervene in. Some of the later in life, they might experience some heart disease, they might experience some diabetes, they might be dealing with some disability and other types of social problems, like being unable to hold a job, or just kind of struggling in different ways in society. And then, the last thing that we kind of are trying to prevent is, but we are finding in research in our tribal communities, is just the shortened lifespan, so that early death. And so this image is not meant to tell us that our children's destiny. It's not meant to say that because our children are exposed to trauma that they are destined for an early death. The risk is higher for that, even when they don't participate in some of these, when they don't adopt the health risk behaviors, they still, sometimes we're finding that they still struggle with some of the diseases and social issues later in life. But our business as educators is really to intervene and to prevent some of that trauma exposure, and to support students so that they're able to heal and recover. So going back to that initial conversation, that trauma, healing from trauma is possible even when we can't prevent it. And sometimes as educators, that's a difficult position that we're in, right? We have children that come into our schools, our buildings, our classrooms, and they are they've already been exposed to trauma. They're already suffering from the effects of it. And so our role as educators is really in helping to provide some healing. So we're going to now move into how do we provide support to young people with the next slide. It all begins with the reason why we're talking so much about the impact of trauma is because we really want to shift the mindset that we might be having when we're trying to figure out, well, what do we do? What do we do when a young person is behaving in a way that is out of control, that is harmful, that is not, that is kind of putting their future at risk and maybe affecting those around them. And so, how do we respond? What do we do? And so, first of all, first of all, we often talk about a trauma-informed lens, and putting on a trauma-informed lens, sometimes that doesn't come naturally to us. Sometimes it takes a little bit of effort, especially when we see repeated patterns of behavior. We may begin to think that it's a hopeless case, or there's nothing that we can do that is going to be that's going to change that child's behavior. And so one of the things that kind of helps us is to really try to look to the function of the behaviors that we're seeing, and trying to understand that sometimes, in some cases, those behaviors are linked to their past trauma histories. And so we may not know their past trauma histories as educators, as administrators. We may not know, everything that has happened to that family or to that in that child's life. Um, they may, their own family may not know. It may be something that has not been that child has not spoken of yet. And so all we may be seeing is just the behaviors. And so when we are confronted with those behaviors, um, our job as educators, if we want to provide trauma-informed care, is really to think about um, how those behaviors may be linked to past trauma histories, and how those behaviors are survival mechanisms. They're really meant to try and protect that child. It's really learned behavior. It's really a way in which that child's brain has been wired in order to seek protection, in order to avoid some of the pain and hurt that they may have experienced in the past. And so really trying to move towards this understanding that children, even the adults the ones in our families, the ones in that we work with, are struggling to cope. And so they may never been given the opportunity or resources, or chances to really learn how to cope in more healthy ways. And so there might be patterns of behavior that is difficult to break. And so we just kind of put on that trauma lens and understand that those that we work with, those that we come into contact with, especially the students that we serve, are just struggling to cope with what they've experienced in the past. So that shift from um, what's wrong with this kid to what happened, just like Dr. Bruce Perry talks about in his book, what happened to this kid, what happened to you. And that's part of the work of really looking at the function of behaviors, to really start to try and understand where those behaviors are coming from. So I'll go ahead and pass it back over to Amy.
All right, thank you, Veronica. So we're going to kind of move to the end of this presentation by looking at resilience and some different protective factors that make up resilience. And I will cover a few of those, and Veronica will cover some others. So to start off this conversation, just think about, we all know people that have lived through traumas and have been able to manage or overcome those experiences. So what are some of the characteristics, qualities, habits, maybe mindsets, beliefs, or behaviors? It's a lot of different things here that seem to give people the strength to overcome trauma. What are some things that come to mind for you that help people sort of bounce back? What is it? What does it take? And essentially, this is how we describe resilience. What makes people resilient? Any ideas? We all know people. Maybe we are those people. Maybe we have friends, family. What makes us resilient? Support and talking with others through the experiences, finding a purpose outside of ourselves. Very nice examples. Absolutely. Having a support system that is reliable. focusing on what they can do and change, share what you have control over and what you don't. Prayer, meditation, or medication, or both. Connection, context, choice, understanding our autonomic nervous system. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Dana. Meditation, medication. But for some, positive personal connections with others, coping strategies, grounding techniques, counseling, individualized support. Awesome. Sometimes anger as a driving force to continue on. Yeah, like, hey, I did not deserve this. I'm going to do something about this. Thank you. Yeah. Great. Being told that the behavior is different than who they are. Right. Separating that, the person from what they're choosing to act on. Thank you. Great. Support from elders. Nice. Yeah, these are great examples of what resilience is. And I'm going to move to sharing a definition that comes from Harvard's University's Center for the Developing Child. And they say that resilience is a positive adaptive response in the face of significant adversity. So it's basically getting knocked down and being able to bounce back, right? We know that, we've seen that, we've experienced that, but so then where does it come from? It's not, it's definitely not a fixed characteristic that we either have resilience or we don't have resilience. Someone isn't resilient or not. There's no set amount that we can use up. And it really does come from a number of places, and a lot of the places that you all identified already. So our environments, the different resources and supports that we have around us to help us. That was mentioned quite a bit. Also genetics. Some of us are just more prone genetically to have a stronger predisposition towards resilience. And also from our experiences. So we can learn from what works and what doesn't in different situations, and to be able to develop this ability and response to cope over time. And so, while some of us might have more of a genetic predisposition, or some of us might have more access to resources in our environments, regardless, resilience can be taught, and it can be developed and strengthened and enhanced. Right? And children are especially, not made for that, especially capable of developing this, because our brains and bodies are still developing. So, but we do want to caution that resilience can also erode if we are not, intentionally working towards staying connected with those supportive resources and doing the things that keep us healthy and keep us going. So it's very much a flexible, adaptable process. And just as there's science behind trauma, there's also science behind resilience, more and more every day. And the factors that we just spoke about that make us resilient really offset the impacts of that trauma that we can have. So there's a short little video here, about 2 minutes, and it's a nice description of protective factors and how they can counterbalance that adverse experiences. So here we go. Oops, sorry.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
I didn't want to respond to the chat simply because I pressed a button, it would stop the video. So we have some comments. Sometimes people find new meaning in relationships, gain new perspective on what's really important to them, post-traumatic growth. Okay, great. Thanks, David. And Mark says the photograph of the mother holding her child close in her arms, that's a great photo, is a sentiment and action that we need more of in our communities, creating activities to demonstrate the genuine care and concern about their problems. Great, thank you. We do need more of that. I agree, thank you. So how can we foster this resilience? You know, we've all heard people praise other people for, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps or, being tough enough, toughing it out to get past their struggles. But these are really cliches that might, have their place in some conversations, but they can really be harmful in the context of talking about trauma and resilience. We'd never expect someone with a severe trauma history just to decide one day to, I'm going to do better. I'm going to be positive. I'm going to stay positive. And, encouraging them in this way might actually contribute to making them feel worse about themselves than they already do and sort of promote a greater sense of hopelessness. Why can't I just get over it like others seem to? So positive responses to adversity tend to happen because of this mix of resources that we might have around us in our lives and the way those resources interact with our inner traits and experiences. And based on a lot of different research, a common group of factors have been identified that make people more likely to be resilient. And these are what's called protective factors that I'm sure you're all very aware of. So having them certainly doesn't eliminate the effects of trauma, but they can soften the effects and provide some stability even in the face of severe stress. And then when we have several protective factors in place, and again, we can build them, we can really thrive in spite of exposure to really serious traumatic events in our lives. So I'm going to share 3 of them. Protective. The first here is relationships. We all know this, right? There's so much research around that shows over and over and over in all different contexts that the single most important protective factor for our children who experience trauma is having at least one solid, trusting relationship with a supportive adult. We know this, and this adult, it can be a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a neighbor, a teacher, a coach, anyone in the community that's able to fill that role. And it's not so much who the person or who those people are, but the sort of quality of that relationship, the characteristics of that relationship. And so some 3 key conditions here include the relationship is unconditional. So I can screw up and you will still be there for me, right? You'll accept my mistakes and you'll support me in learning from them. Also, the relationship is stable. So the person, you can always turn to that person. Maybe they're not accessible 24/7, but they'll make time when they're able. They're consistently there for you. It's not 1 minute, I'm with you, and the next minute, I want nothing to do with you. It's stable. And we have to be able to trust that person, right? We know they've got our back. We know they're going to protect us and not hurt us. So those are kind of the three key conditions to that relationship that's really supportive. And this kind of relationship, it insulates a child or a person who's experiencing trauma from the effects of it. You know, they might still be dealing with trauma, but with that trusting relationship, the effects aren't so toxic. And this relationship provides this structure, kind of a place where a person can go to get the support that allows them to build skills and sort of avoid engaging in more unhealthy coping strategies. So healing after trauma can begin to occur when we start to see that there are actually people we can trust, right? That make promises and keep them, and that say they won't hurt us and they don't. So I just want you to take a moment to think about, you know, because we're all here and we are here for a reason. We're all professionals. We've made it in some way. Who was that person for you in your life? Just, and throw it in the chat if you don't mind. And thanks, Mark, for your comment. Good parenting advice. Information is helpful. Yep. All right, Dana, it was her mother. She's that rock for her. Elaine's parents. For me, it was my grandmother. A teacher for another, for Amy, grandma for Jeffrey, mom and godparents. Right? Aren't we lucky? Aren't we blessed? But we sometimes say relationship is the trauma-informed intervention. You know, so much trauma happens within the context of relationship. So if we can have that, we can make it. Thanks, Karen, mother, grandmother, adopted grandmother. All right. It's good to take a moment to sort of reflect on who these people were for us in our lives. Maybe stop and thank them. So the next protective factor, I know we have to move along, is building mastery. So having a sense of mastery over our own lives. And when we believe that we can overcome difficulties and shape our lives, we're much better able to bounce back from trauma than when we're feeling completely out of control, like things are just continuing to happen to us and we're not able to control that, and that they're going to continue to happen to us. So when we see that we have choice within our control, healing becomes more possible, you know, and we get away from that notion of our trauma defining us. And we don't always naturally feel a sense of control, especially based on our life circumstances. So if we've had difficult home lives, experienced a lot of loss, we may have a lot of good reason for feeling like we don't have control. So but we can build that sense of mastery over our circumstances, and we can help support our youth in the belief that they have control over their lives. You know, this is kind of a hard journey to kind of lift that sense of, you know, foreshortened future, or always taking the blame to, you know, my future is in my hands. I can actually do things to change the path that I'm on. We can help them see they have choices, create opportunities to build skills that will help them feel a greater sense of control. And that leads into our next protective factor. So we can support them in making those good choices. And starting at an early age, of course, is going to be more effective and powerful. So some of the skills that we can teach, and these are areas that are often impacted by trauma, right? So the executive functioning skills, that ability to control impulses, to make good choices, to think through problems, to analyze, to kind of be able to focus, think about the future, understand short and long-term consequences, be able to envision a positive future and actually set some goals to take steps to meet those goals. So we can teach a lot of those skills. And it's, again, that prefrontal cortex that's often being underutilized. Those muscles are not always being exercised because our limbic system is is taking over. So another area then is that self-regulation, which is directly linked to that limbic system, or that area of our brain that detects danger, which is overactivated. So if we can get a better sense of control over our emotions that can seem out of control, then we can re-engage our brain and start to work on those more executive functioning skills. And so self-regulation, our kids are often don't know what they're feeling, don't know how to discriminate between different types of feelings. Is it anger? Is it nervousness? Is it frustration, excitement? Where are these feelings coming from? How do they show up in our bodies? Are they related to other parts of our bodies? Do our thoughts kind of guide sometimes the way that we think? And so learning about how all these things are connected and how to then sort of use modulation activities, grounding, breathing, muscle relaxation, walking, prayer, whatever it might be, to help self-regulate those emotions, and then skills around being able to express those emotions, what I'm feeling, why I'm feeling that way, what I need, what I want. And so I wanted to just take this moment to share a resource called Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Competency Trauma Treatment Model. I'll also type it in the chat. Developed by doctors Margaret Blaustein and Christine Kinneberg. And it really focuses on ages 2 all the way through 21. So there are example activities for early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence around these areas of executive functioning, self-regulation, and also self-development and positive identity. So it's a really great resource. And so, we're all able to learn these skills, not necessarily born with them. We often learn them early on through relationships with our caregivers. And when we do have that support from adults who can make us feel safe, then we're able to practice and improve these skills. But we can promote these through regular routines, modeling appropriate social skills, and really through that engaging, that trusting relationship, trusting and supportive relationship with kids, we can also be modeling and teaching these skills. All right, I will now pass it over to Veronica to talk about another protective factor. Thank you. Do you want me to just click through the slides, Veronica? Or
Sure.
should I stop? Okay.
So I'm gonna go ahead and share a fourth protective factor, which is cultural and or spiritual connections. And so the 3 other protective factors that we shared in research that has been done related to Indigenous youth, we have found that those protective factors are just as effective with them as they are with other youth. And so, but what we have found in research is that this fourth protective factor is unique to tribal youth. So one of the assets, one of the strengths of our tribal people and our tribal communities is our culture and our cultures and our spiritual practices and spiritual beliefs. There are cultural values. They are the cultural skills and talents. They are that sense of belonging that we get from our kinship systems. It's the connection to land that and place that our tribal peoples have had and continue to have. And so research is showing us that this is actually one of the strongest protective factors when it comes to tribal youth. And so I wanted to share a video with you all on the next slide. Just gives an example of one school. This is in Montana, a school on a reservation in Montana that really talks about what they've been doing in their community towards these efforts. I know it looks differently for all of us in all of the schools and communities that we work in. So this is just one example, reservation-based example that we'll share today.
You can't compare what it was like when I grew up. I grew up at the agency. There were maybe 5 families living there. There were no homes, there were no houses. All of it was just country. There was more family interaction. Families stayed together, they helped one another. There was so few of us. Every single family on this reservation is a good family. They're strong. They survived the Holocaust. Every family has that strength within that family, and we need to recognize that and empower that. This whole problem started from the boarding school, and it's filtered down to now where in our community it's the best kept secret. We don't talk about it, we don't deal with it, we don't teach about it, but it's the biggest problem that we have. And then underneath it are all those other problems, you know, drugs, alcohol, suicide, all these other things. To me, they're under that umbrella of sexual abuse.
Something has to be done. Here in the school, but in the homes as well. People aren't taking the time to learn about culture. We examine that word culture in all its components. Because for us here, Fort Belknap, you say Indian culture, right away they think powwow, they think sweat lodge, Sundance, and that's it. But culture is so much more. It's like all these little components that make up that word culture. The way we dress, our dwellings, you know, traditional dwellings, our traditional food, music, dance.
And I don't know if it would solve them, but one way it would be to get our younger people interested in our cultures, our ceremonies, the ways that we used to have a long time ago.
I'm working on a piece of quill work. It's an earring. Only one side's done. All these little things are little quills from porcupines. Yeah, not many people around here know how to do it anymore. The thing that they basically do is most the time is beading, and there's only a couple people that know how to do quill work or even tack quill work.
Can you tell me about your dresses that you made?
Yeah, me and my mom made them. We just make them right at home. And we have 2 sewing machines, and we like take turns just sewing and have to sketch them out before everything.
This is buffalo hide. What we're doing is we're scraping the hair off so we can prepare it for like a drum. Well, when we're done scraping it, we take it off this rack so we could lace it onto a drum.
One of the components of culture is games. And with stick games, most of the tribes have their own way of playing stick game. And so then we learn about the Cheyenne style of stick game, Crow style of stick game, Flathead style, Blackfeet style, Ahani style. It's all these different tribes and their ways of playing stick game. It helps us to further understand our own way of playing stick game, and as well as the ceremonial game called hand game here on Fort Belknap. Should students ever want to go and participate in a hand game ceremony or in a stick game tournament, they'll have that understanding.
It's our traditional ceremonial hand game. When they sponsor a hand game, whoever sponsors a hand game is because somebody is usually sick in their family, or like take, for example, if they got some young person going into the service They put a hand game on for them so that they'll stay out of harm's way and return home. We weren't plagued with drugs. We didn't have TVs. We certainly didn't have cell phones. As a result of that, we went to visit your family, we went to visit someone else's family. And a lot of our culture was through that, the stories that went with our culture, with our religion. Where now, that's the last thing anybody wants to talk about. They want to sit there and watch TV or on a cell phone, even if they got company. At that time, we listened to our elders.
I've struggled for a long time with to what extent we should allow technology within our culture. Our young people know this technology really well. I think it's definitely a way to preserve parts of our culture, but there's a lot of our culture that can't be preserved within technology. One thing that we really work on in this classroom here all year long is relearning how to listen. That listening can become a way of learning for us, as it once was a long time ago.
I went to a boarding school when I was 14 years old for 4 years, and we had 500 students there. And we had all different types. We had Sioux, we had Omaha from Nebraska, Sac and Fox, all different kind of tribes. So there was no one particular language, you know. But yet in all, we all came together as Indians. We didn't come as a Gros we didn't come as a Assiniboine, we didn't come as a Sioux. We came together as a people, Indian people, and that made it strong for us. We don't have that today, that togetherness.
These are our children in this school. We need to be teaching what we're talking about here today. That needs to be a part of what we're doing, is empowering our children to be proud of themselves, to like what they're doing. These problems aren't going to be solved in one generation. You know, if you start now, in 10 years, you'll see the impact of that.
All right, so I encourage you to check out MAPS Media website, MAPS Media Institutes. They work with different schools and community programs to produce some of these student developed films. And so there are others that kind of share some examples of how educators are connecting tribal youth to their cultures. So this is just one example. I want to give you guys a chance to just drop in the chat if you know what's going on in your community. What are some things that you're able to do for the students that you're serving, that's helping to connect them with their culture, that's helping them to develop their executive functioning and self-regulation skills, that is building that trusting, consistent, unconditional relationship with them, and that is helping to build a sense of mastery for them. So feel free to share that in the chat. Any examples that's happening in your schools around these 4 protective factors that we've shared. And if you can't think of anything right off the top of your head, I also encourage you to just drop in the chat, you know, some ideas, something that stood out to you from these sessions we've been having today, that you want to take back to your school, that you want to explore more. All right, so we have an individual, Silverhorn Wolf, who's utilizing a SAMHSA program to provide culture-based activities inside the classroom. So they're developing a tribal informed curriculum. That is absolutely awesome. They're also attending tribal consultations with local education agencies. So Elaine sharing that at their school, they have a weekly community breakfast where the students actually do the cooking and invite their families to the school. That's so awesome. And Dana shared that they are creating safe spaces for students, youth to share about their feelings, whether it's in the classroom, community center, etc. They spread the message that it is okay to share feelings and emotions. Awesome, thank you so much. And Amy, thanks for joining us, Amy, and she's sharing that she teaches the youth and community adults about building webs of support. So relationships, protective factors, knowing themselves and social norms in their families, schools, and communities, and looking through a strength-based lens to see value in themselves, their culture, their communities, and their families. That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, feel free to continue to share. We want to go ahead and move to the next slide and just ask if anybody has any questions. Before we wrap up today, we have a few more minutes. Oh, awesome. Brenda is sharing that their school district uses Navajo peacemaking to resolve student conflicts, which includes parents and students. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm glad that's happening. Traditional forms of conflict resolution. Any questions from you guys for the last two sessions that we've had today? Amy and I can do our best to answer. If not, I will go ahead and put our website in the chat. Feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in any kind of support in implementing trauma-informed care in your community, with your youth programs or with your schools. You can also reach out to us individually as well. Here's one that Brenda shares a question. Brenda Whitehorse is asking, what would we recommend for how schools should communicate with families? What do you think, Amy?
Yeah, that's a big question, a big one. And it always goes back to creating, just as we talk about trying to create safe spaces for our youth, our students, it's, in order for a lot of our families just do not feel welcome in the school setting. And so really trying to address that, how can we make how can we create a space where families do want to come in and where they do feel honored and valued and not, judged or criticized, or, because a lot of times our families are doing as, what they can with what they have, and maybe it's not, maybe missing a lot of events or meetings or, but we just want to value their time. So, sometimes it's doing things instead of talking recently at a school, they decided our families don't really feel comfortable in this setting. And some of that goes back to boarding school. But in the community, there's a community center where people go for a lot of different things, and they're wanting to try having events there. But however we can build trust and, provide that validation that our families are doing what they can and expressing that to them.
Yep.
I'm sure
all
many
about
people
applying-
have other ideas.
It's all about applying that trauma-informed lens to how and what that would look like in terms of communicating with them. So absolutely. Thank you, Amy. I know we're at time, so I want to go ahead and pass it back over to Capella.
All right. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. And another huge thank you to Amy and Veronica for an awesome presentation. After this, be sure to catch our closing ceremony at 5:35 Eastern Time. Just some reminders, be sure to rate this session and fill out the final feedback survey for the entire meeting. So don't forget, you can watch this session and all sessions after the day is over on this website. We'll see everyone at the closing ceremony. Amy and Veronica.
Thank you guys so much for being with us this afternoon. Have a great
Thanks.
rest of your conference.